Front and center, men. This is the Center for Syncretic Studies podcast. I'm Tim Kirby, and with me, as always, is
Joaquin Flores. How you doing tonight?
Good. And how are you doing? Hot in
I'm
Serbia?
doing quite well. Yeah, it's good to hear from you. Good to see you.
Well, tonight's topic is a big one. It's a bit of a mystery man, I should say. It is probably the most interesting candidate from the Democrats who may replace Trump in a little bit. And who would that be, Joaquin?
Well, we're talking about Andrew Yang, and viewers might know Yang Gang, but if not, we'll get into it. But definitely, it's a most interesting and most curious character and candidate all around.
Yeah, he's definitely the most different, I'll put it that way. But the thing is, in some ways, he's almost like a Democrat in Trump's clothing. Now, you and I have a bit of a maybe disagreement about Yang. I think his main key feature is the universal basic income, that's really what he is, and everything else is some secondary stuff. You see him as Mr. Alt-Right, as maybe the usurper of the alt-right movement, some sort of distraction from the real causes. So did I put your case in the right context? Do you agree with the way I phrased your opinion? And if so, why?
I would
also,
actually agree with you. I would actually agree with you that UBI, I mean, there's no doubt that universal basic income is his primary talking point, right?
Yeah. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that. But what is the alt-right, and why is Yang a part of it, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's just the more acceptable, part of that basket of deplorables. So the Hillary Clinton, really effed up her campaign, polarizing the population and taking, I guess, what amounted to 48 and something% of the population and calling them a basket of deplorables. But it's really there's certain issues that he's focusing on that are not UBI, that are, I guess, his like tangential talking points that are kind of interesting to a lot of people. Whether you're talking about accelerationism, automation, men's rights light. A lot of things that kind of started to build up in the YouTube blogosphere from 2008 or 9 onwards, maybe as somewhat of a response to the Gamergate, or building up to Gamergate, maybe somewhat of a response to the direction that certain websites took. Yeah.
It's a response to everything that's happening right now. Every wacky SJW third wave feminist position. That's really what all that sort of men's rights activism and a lot of these Yangisms are coming from. They're really a reaction to that silliness that's out there. That's kind of it. But when we're talking about him and a lot about the automation, that's really for him to justify his universal basic income. Because again, my sort of view on him is that everything, no matter what it is, always goes back to universal basic income, because really Yang is not a spiritual, philosophical person. He seems to have this very almost Republican-like, you exist to have a job, your existence is to make money, the economy is all that matters, there's nothing spiritual or human, and if men commit suicide because they don't have a job, it's not that there's something maybe spiritually wrong or that there's a meaninglessness to life or there's other situations. It's because they lost their job, they need to get back in the economy. That's kind of how I see Yang. I mean,
the thing is, I don't disagree with your point that everything he's saying draws back to UBI, and we actually agree that UBI is his like main talking point. So of course, I think it's cogent that all his extra stuff ties back into it. But how I sort of see the candidate is that he's not really out there to win unless they have certain traps set up. I mean, I'm willing to allow that certain traps have been set up. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, most of his biographical claims of recent past will not hold up to scrutiny. So calling himself an entrepreneur, I don't know. I mean, look, if you're a creation of the nonprofit industrial complex and the confluence of Andy Stern's SEIU and the Obama administration, and your notable career has been chasing those grants to create NGOs that are financed by government subsidies, I don't know that that's a definition of what you or I would call an
Well, yeah,
entrepreneur.
I mean, basically, in a lot of ways, his background, he looks like a glorified Job Corps instructor. Nothing against Job Corps
That's
instructors.
right.
My father was one of them.
No,
But I'm saying
it's
that's
noble work,
that's
but it's not an
business. Yeah.
entrepreneur.
However, one thing that I do have to say is his view of his the training program that he was doing, or re-education or whatever, was very similar to my father's in that it's kind of pointless, it's kind of fruitless. I mean, my dad actually had one year the best results at the Cleveland Job Corps, and he had like a 3% turnover rating, meaning that 3% of the former inmates, they were usually people who had legal problems, they were coming out of prison, so 3% of the general former inmates were able to take the profession he was teaching them and actually run with it and become successful with it. So that also goes to show you this concept of let's just educate people and everyone will be happy. Well, 3% of them. Even my father said that it's really a matter of lifestyle. He said the whole point of Job Corps was actually to get a person out of a sort of a trailer park or ghetto lifestyle, get them 2 years out of it, and hopefully clear their mind to go on and do something else.
Yeah,
teaching them how to have a trade
right.
is secondary.
I mean, the structure of the capitalist lifestyle and the work cycle in modernity is that they want to get you. I mean, they socialize kids from the age of 5, 6, 7 years old, that they're waking up in the morning and they're going to school, and then they try to get you directly from high school to some kind of technical school or college, university. You maybe that is a couple years of a flexible schedule for some, but most students have to work, and then you jump right full time into the workforce, and you're working from 8 a.m. till 8 p.m. 6 days a week. So and then so if you have someone that got into a lifestyle, so I totally see the sense in that from a functionalist, from the point of view of functionalism and sociology. I mean, it completely makes sense. But I think the point that I wanted to make about Yang is that, I mean, we're only scratching the surface if we talk about these things. It's a fundamental issue that the Democrats have realized that their other candidates are boring and that there's no message. And he's really the only candidate to have a message. But, I actually have been a longtime supporter of universal basic income as a transitional demand to a new type of economy, the type of dynamic new economy that we don't yet have, but that we will have.
Now, then why do you seem to be so strongly against the only candidate that I've ever seen in recent U.S. history to be offering up this idea of UBI? Why do you seem so skeptical of him then?
Well, I realize that American politicians are fundamentally actors, right? And I also know that they're engaged in an ideological project, and I haven't, I would say that, and it's actually crazy to have to say this, but in my lifetime, I was born in 1978, and I've been voting since, I guess, the second Clinton term, and in the 90s. And there's not been a single presidential candidate that's kept their primary, let's say their primary pledge on a campaign.
Well, basically the key promise that they made to get elected, they could really never keep that promise. But that goes back to this flawed thing where people say in jest that the presidential elections are a popularity contest. They really are, because all that matters is winning. Yeah. And even if let's just say, even if these people are honest, let's just say that even if Trump really deep in his heart believes that he wants to make America great again, he's got to deal with Congress and the Supreme Court. You know what I mean? So even if you try, you'll still fail.
What I was going to say is interesting, because I was saying this is actually kind of strange to have to say, is that for me, what matters, not living in the United States, I have tremendous sympathy for Americans. I'm from the United States, as are you. I have tremendous empathy for what Americans are going through. But I really don't, where my sympathies end is if they're willing to put food in their bellies at the expense of dropping bombs on other countries. So I don't really go for the national socialism that gets, proposed by the likes of Obama or, you see what I'm saying? So I don't go for that.
And also remember with Obama, why one thing that's very frustrating about him is, remember, he was very, very popular when he got into office. Popular enough that he could probably have ridden that wave to really push through. Because, all these wacky people who wear pink hats and went outside when Trump was elected to protest and scream and yell and maybe be possessed by demons or something. When Obama, if he came on TV and told them to protest for his idea, for his policy, do this, that, or the other, he could have. He could have used populism to achieve great things. He didn't. Even things that were very minor, that he had a lot of control over himself, because obviously the president can't make law. People forget this. The president cannot make law, but he probably could close Guantanamo. He had 8 years.
You could sign an executive order, and they have the line item veto. And after 2008, they had the majority in both houses. I mean, they had a liberal Supreme Court.
Yeah.
They had, I guess Justice Roberts had already come in under a Bush appointment, so kind of had split the court. But liberal leaning, I guess you still had Kennedy, you still had Ginsburg. And I think that when Obama was elected, I mean, they swept in. And in the following election, they also picked up more, I think, in the Senate. And so, but when he was elected, there was also a congressional race. If I recall correctly, I know they had the majority in the White House. Obviously, they had the president. They had the majority in the upper house and the lower house. Mm-hmm. They could have done anything of that, any party discipline, if they were actually committed to the things that they're committed to doing. And I guess that's really, to fundamentally answer your question, is that I think that Republicans, insofar as they've been an openly pro-business party, I think that Republicans more honestly represent the policies that they end up pursuing. Not that they're policies that I generally like, but they actually, say, hey, we're going to decrease taxes for the rich, and we're going to decrease, funding for schools. And that's what they do. But what Democrats do is they make sort of more anti-austerity or more like social democratic gestures or pseudo promises, and then or campaign promises. And then once they're elected, it's like, we can't. It's political gridlock. Maybe, when I don't have to get reelected, I'll do it in my second 4 years. Or whatever. So I don't, I don't fundamentally buy the story.
But ultimately, going back to Yang, then, is the big thing is if he has this one big promise, I think universal basic income is very appealing to a lot of people I know. I have to also say, I remember you don't come from money, and I certainly do not come from money. So this is when I say I know a lot of people. That also means I know a lot of people in the lower middle class, and that's sort of the bottom of American society along with me here, who definitely would be very excited about this idea. They're going to vote for that. There is zero guarantee that he could make that happen.
Well, the funny thing that you were mentioning earlier about is not approaching it from a spiritual or kind of ethical, moral point of view, and that way kind of sounds more like a business Republican. I actually, in defense of the argument that he made, if you watch his interview on the Joe Rogan show, first of all, he says, well, that's $1,000 per person. So that's going to encourage couples to stay married because it's per person. So if you're in a single household, your relative costs are decreased. So in other words, like, let's say you're married and you have two kids that are close in age and now they're college age. And now you're thinking, now they want to go away to school, or are they going to stay home? Or, maybe it's better that you could even afford to refinance an expansion on your house if you have an extra $2,000 a month. I mean, it's actually crazy. So
you could, while your children. Well, the thing is, he didn't mention specifically that they'd pay for children, but it could be
it doesn't. But I'm saying if you have 18, if you have adult, Tim, listen, brother, if you have two kids that are living at home and going to college and they're 18 and 21, which is very common in the United States, as you know, to live at home until folks are 25, 30, 35, right? Given the economic catastrophe the poverty that's being really hidden in America is such that people live at home through their 20s, more often than not, I think. Yeah. So now that's another $2,000. If you have two kids, so now you're married and you have two kids that are adults, that's $4,000 a month per household without employment.
Yeah, now, right? Joaquin, you're what you just said. You're starting to. You've been in Eastern Europe, I think, too long, just like I have. That's a very Eastern European way of thinking of, okay, every person gets $1,000. So if I have a wife and I have a few kids, we can all pool this and we're going to have this awesome house and build a future. But remember, that's where I go back to the spiritual crisis. Most people in America don't think that way. We have this very bizarre idea that, okay, I'm 18, I need to go rent something just so I can not live and not see my parents, and I'll rent some sort of dump and live there rather than contributing to my family. This also goes back to the whole spiritual thing of family values. What you just said is a very rational Slavic view of the situation. Whereas, to be honest, when I know people who are on like SSI and stuff like that, they have that situation where they're getting sort of money for nothing. They don't use it to pool resources and live with their parents, ever.
Well, the thing is that, I'm just saying what the guy said in the Joe Rogan interview. He specifically said that this would encourage families to stay together. It might encourage families to live together. And he said that if people didn't have this sort of, rent income thing hanging over their head, it was going to encourage volunteerism. It's going to encourage local communities. It's going to encourage entrepreneurship. I mean, all these things that he said are have some truth value. Now there's like devils in the details.
But they would have to give some instruction and really tell people about this, because again, he has a sort of free market thing of like, well, we're going to create this sort of situation, so let the free market deal with it. Of the free market of essentially giving people the money, and they have the freeing up their time to do whatever they want. But the thing is, I think without some sort of guidance, only a small minority of people are actually going to do that. So I don't know. Again, it's this lack of the spiritual component that's just kind of killer. However, I actually think, the more I think about it, especially the one thing that Yang really sold me on his version of universal basic income, is that it's absolutely for everyone, even billionaires, because then that makes it not some form of welfare, but also just sort of an equal policy that everyone gets for being American, which I think is, again, logically, effectiveness-wise, and spiritually the way to go. Because the one thing is, with any sort of welfare, Social Security, SSI for disability, it really becomes a trap. It becomes a trap.
Right.
And the thing is, we can't allow this to become the same welfare trap. I mean, just for example, right, I would be a good example of this situation myself, because I am around the poverty line in America, because Russian money doesn't make much, right? So my kids get Obamacare. If I were to somehow double my income, my children would lose Obamacare, and my life might actually be worse, and I may not even be able to actually send my kids to ever spend time in America ever. Same thing with people who are on disability. They can get money for being disabled, but if they start working, they lose that money, because then that means you're not disabled. Even one example was it was a radio show. Basically, the one guy was disabled. He started doing a radio show and getting paid for it, and he got threatened to lose his SSI because of he was working. But obviously, for the radio show, he needs his mouth, not the rest of his body. But they didn't care. That's work. You lose it. So the one thing is to avoid this welfare trap of making people not able to work when getting the benefits, is you have to be everyone gets $1,000. Do whatever you want. No checking, no disability, no nothing. Very critical. And Yang is on the side of that, at least.
Look, I couldn't agree with you more. It's just that what I focus on with what Yang is doing, they're actually the focus on the UBI is really connected very much to these post-apocalyptic and post-employment and automation stuff. So there's a certain interview he does with a couple of young Asian American young men, and they're like eating food. They're eating like some Chinese or Vietnamese food together. And in the video that streamed on Twitter, you just need to let me get this point across. I need to say a few things. In what streamed across on Twitter is while they were talking about certain things like post-apocalyptic, they flashed images of like some Mad Max looking scenes and nuclear bombs and stuff. So there's also there's definitely mimetic messaging happening to preppers. And so this is, but what they're talking about, and the sort of mimetic campaign is talking about positivity, a new society. This is really about the fourth industrial revolution and the Internet of Things 3D printing and automation, roboticization. So there was a book in the 90s called The End of Work that had a big impact on how organized labor was looking at the future. And in that same interview with Joe Rogan, Andrew Yang makes a reference that Andy Stern was a friend of his. And if you're not from organized labor or from the world of Change to Win or SEIU, then you wouldn't know that Andy Stern is the former president, still holds a lot of power of the International, or of the Labor Union Confederation rather. And this means that they are deeply tied into the Democratic, the DNC. So, and he also said that he would make the pledge that whatever Democrat wins he would support. So this is what I'm trying to get across to him, and what I hope that viewers will appreciate is that while I support UBI, I don't think that, number one, he's going to win. Number two, I don't think that. I think that the whole thing is being framed. I'm more interested in the long-term ideological project as a feeler and as a sort of new vector that Democrats may try to intersect to sort of win part of this Trump base. And a part of this Trump base is based into ironic, postmodern, post-ironic, mimetic messaging, right? And the Yang Gang phenomenon, they've appropriated the frog. Now, I can see that Yang is acting, okay, because in interviews, he changed his voice and increasingly is sounding more and more like a frog.
Wait, I'm gonna have to review that one. So it's like in the NFL, we'll send it up to review by the.
Yeah, we'll send that up, for the replay. But you gotta check that out. Now, look, what I'm saying is that while I actually support even a more radical version of UBI, number one, it doesn't have the support in the United States. Number two, if you listen to the Joe Rogan interview, or it might have, to the Joe Rogan interview, at the end, he makes a reference to Bismarck. Those Bismarck's laws were the anti-socialist laws. And even though they were labor reform laws that introduced things like the 40-hour work week, children's protective services, disability, workers' compensation, the 8-hour day. These were done because the communist and social democratic forces in Germany were rising, right? This is the time.
Yeah, that was to essentially avert a communist revolution.
Right, exactly.
And that's what it did. And that's a lot of ways why communism didn't take off in the West, is because they preemptively sort of stole their thunder. And in
Western
ways,
Europe, the United States, it was a little more brutal. I mean, you had westward expansionism through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s.
The main thing is, for any people here who want to make change, that's a good example of, if you're focused on actually making the change and you want that 40-hour-a-week work week, which is a big plus to the quality of human life, then you have to be focused on winning that mission. Now, when you start to hear people who talk more about revolution, maybe they have these ideas, but the only thing they want is revolution, that's the people who are really dangerous, because their objective isn't really the 40-hour-a-week work week. It's something else. So,
the thing, however, when you go, it's like bargaining, though. I mean, like, when you're going to sit down and bargain, you don't bargain against yourself. So you might have to go in saying revolution, because what you want is a 40-hour work week. Like, if you go in saying 40-hour work week, you're going to get a 60-hour work week, right?
Well, yeah, so if you go in saying, well, we're going to stand here with signs and quietly talk to each other and chant things until you give us what we want. Yeah,
not going to happen.
There has to be a bit of threats. What I more was referring to were certain people in history who have rather than trying to achieve objectives, just want power. It's something to be sort of aware of. But that's getting off the beaten trail of what we're talking about today. Because one thing I had to also mention is about Yang. He's short and he has no personality. He's okay at speaking. He speaks very clearly. He probably makes a lot more verbal flubs than I do when we're doing this podcast. But he's not interesting. He's not dynamic, and he's tiny. And even though his idea might be really appealing, I don't really think he has any chance against people who are more either clownish or at least colorful in their delivery. So
right.
I don't think
I agree with you there.
Yeah.
I would say that's spot on. So then how does that fit into the Democrats' strategy? As I have it, they are trying to run that their goal is to basically run everybody all at once because they don't have a single candidate that people actually like. They don't have a candidate that everyone is going to hold their nose and get around. There's no one that they're showing that looks like they can beat Trump. I don't believe the polls because those were the same corrupted polling agencies that said that Trump was going to lose.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're in some sort of post-polling society here where polls don't seem to have anything to do with reality, which is unfortunate. Well, the thing is, the simplest solution, I'm not saying that this is the best solution, but the simplest one is run all the candidates, and at some point down the line, like a rugby player, when Yang gets tackled and knocked out, he's got to lateral the ball to someone else to keep running with it. That ball being UBI. Whether that be Joe Biden or maybe Sanders. To be honest, there's something very appealing about Sanders to certain people. I think it's his New York sort of way of talking or something about him. It's clownish but endearing.
It's like a clownish grandfather, yeah.
Yeah, he's grandfatherly, but in like a positive way, sort of like a
I think
social
so, right.
Santa Claus. AOC has no chance because she's has what it takes to be popular, but not what it takes to be president. Because deep down, there's the thing of even these feminists, they're probably not going to vote for a woman, even though they're feminists. It's one of those weird things. And especially a woman who's very pretty and very feminine, a bit airheady.
She also has no experience.
Well, that didn't. Obama had no experience. Experience doesn't matter. Propaganda.
Well, I mean,
matters,
Obama was in Congress.
Yeah.
And but I see what you're saying. I just think that AOC is a poor debater. I mean, she can barely read a script.
Well, yeah, that too. She will get crushed. She is Sarah Palin
That's
in
it.
a Democratic uniform. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, like, look, I agree. I agree with what you're saying that he doesn't really have a chance to win. It's not the candidate, but I mean, he could. I mean, they're trying to paint him. I mean, the sort of buzz is precisely that he's small, that he sounds like a frog, that he is the frog from the Pepe the Frog memes. So
Maybe.
That's actually what they're actually going for, that he's like this underdog, that he's this and look, like he's a like what is the growing threat that Trump is saying exists in the world? It's China, right? And there he is, he's a Chinese guy, right? So you see this, so then he can't attack China without like attacking Yang. And Yang said, well, I think we've already worked it out, like what Trump's going to call me. He's going to call me Comrade Yang, right? Because he's got the UBI. He's Chinese. You see, but it's actually he knows and he's setting it up. I think that the most interesting campaign is Yang. I think the most intelligent mimetic warfare people are working on the Yang campaign.
Oh, well, the most intelligent campaign. Oh, that's Yang without a doubt. But that's also, I think, in some ways, some of his downfall, because if Yang in his mind thinks, I'm going to make a statistical, rational appeal to people, and they'll respond to my fantastic statistics. That's not how human beings.
That's not how human beings work. But I think I think that while he's not an entrepreneur, I think he has that part of the entrepreneurial spirit of being a bullshit artist. Then that would go, if we're going bullshit artists, that goes to Biden. But to be honest, as someone as someone who lives in Russia, I want Biden to be nominated because of his horrific connections to the awful events in Kiev in Ukraine. And those have kind of come to light from Trump propagandists now that he's become a candidate and maybe some of his other competition. And it's kind of funny. Only the fact that he's now involved in trying to become the president of the United States, only now does that matter. Being vice president, it didn't matter. But at least it shed some light on that. And also the fact that he's a bit pedophilic. I don't know, pedophilish? He's pedophilic.
Pedophilic, there's the word. I actually like the way British people say it, pedophile. That sounds more powerful. There's pedophiles like the lower grade, pedophile is the high grade. And he,
You're saying a pedophile's a British pedophile?
Oh, no, that's the British pronunciation.
Yeah, I know.
It's more powerful. There's normal pedophiles, but then you get to that Michael Jackson pedophile class. And with all the video of Biden very overly affectionately touching children, women, boy, that's going to be played ad nauseum.
Dude, the guy, I mean, the thing about him is that, see, now his touchy-feely thing and the fact that he's going to trigger, the Me Too movement. See, they're thinking, well, he's a white masculine male who can project some pseudo testosterone. I don't think his balls function at whatever. How old is he? 72. I don't think his balls actually function the same way. But I mean, he's projecting this concept of testosterone, and I think that that's sort of like the idea that they need like a white man to to defeat the white man kind of thing that Democrats think, and that if Joe Biden, I saw this. I remember this hilarious. I think it was like Onion, article from a million years ago. It was a Joe Biden's autobiography, The President of Vice. And, his whole image is totally set up for they already thought this part through is what I'm saying, Tim.
Well, and also remember, always vice presidents have to offset the negatives of the president. And Obama's very effeminate. He's not a real macho guy. Didn't he try to go bowling and he couldn't even hit any of the pins or something? I forget the specifics of that, but during his campaign, he looks unnatural drinking beer. He can't bowl. Apparently he can kind of play basketball. But so anyways, they need, if Obama's sort of like this kind of like, well, I'm just going to talk like this and we're going to talk about hope and change, friends. Then I think Biden had to play up maybe more of I'm a white business guy. Look at me. I love Israel, to sort of compensate for that. So the problem is, that's good as a vice presidential role. That's not good when you want to be the Democrat candidate, because it's not exactly what Democrat or centrist voters are exactly looking for. I don't know if it's Trump won because he was macho per se, but he was very macho in a cowboy, America's awesome, let's be capitalist, let's do this thing, make this country great again sort of way. Masculine in a context, not just masculine. Because if it was a masculinity contest, Obama would never have even gotten to be a candidate.
Oh, yeah, no. Obama won because they were able to mobilize organized labor in the swing states, and the idea, because think of, if you remember, that the left was being mobilized still around this middle class concept of symbolic or representational politics. So in other words, it's kind of like, well, let's vote for her because she's a woman. It's not like you're going to empower all women, but putting this woman in power is like a symbol of whatever. And same with an African American. So we can show that we've defeated racism if we put an African American in the White House. So this was like symbolic politics. I've been very critical of this in my work, my writings and essays and stuff like that. So I'm familiar with how the Democrats think. I worked on the Obama campaign in 2008. I raised, maybe somewhere in the middle six figures for his campaign alone from union members because that was my job to do. So I understand how these ground campaigns work, right?
You were a naive man in your younger years, sir.
Well, I wasn't naive. I mean, I was taking money to do it, and I was. This was 2007, and I known since 1990 that both Democrats and Republicans are capitalist dogs of war. But I was a younger man in my, I guess, early 30s, or as it was, and it was money. And it was my job. I mean, it wasn't my whole job. It was maybe 5% of my job, and that's why I understand how the color revolution thing works. That's how I understand how the left gets co-opted to mobilize for Democrats, even if they think they're socialists or more radical. They're able to bring the organizers or the structures back in line. So I know how that whole Saul Alinsky and Gene Sharp thing and the nonprofit industrial complex, plays out in real life. And the Democrat Party and organized labor are like in bed together. And you have rank and file militants who just hate this shit, and they get targeted by the leadership, by the bureaucracy of the labor unions all the time to kick them out if they're too radical, or get out of line if they're too socialist or something like that. So, I mean, but what I wanted to say, Tim, was very interesting that you were pointing out about Biden's pedophilia. Is that I think the Biden people think that this is going to be like a grab him by the pussy thing, but it's not. This is going to bring like the Pizzagate thing back. And I think that, right? So that's where I see it going. I just don't see, I don't think that Biden.
Because the thing is a lot of things have to do with what's happening in our subconscious. You'll probably, as we do this podcast, people will get sick of me talking about the human subconscious. But with the whole grab her by the pussy thing or whatever that Trump said, on the surface, people in their sort of conscious mind are like, that's awful. How can you say that? But in their subconscious mind, they're like, he was a heterosexual guy, kind of having like locker room talk, whatever they called it on the Howard Stern show, whatever. And I think that with the Biden on the surface, they might be like, well, I stand for LGBT rights, and I guess maybe pedophilia can fit in with that. I don't know. But in their subconscious mind, they're like, 8-year-old adult man, no. No.
I think that's spot on. I'm just completely, I think one of the subjects that move me politically to understand the weight of the culture wars and the direction that, liberalism, modernity, capitalism is all kind of moved in one direction as a Leviathan, is really that 20 years ago, people who were critical of LGBT radicalism were saying that the next step is going to be pedophilia, and everyone back then was promising, no way, that's hate mongering, fear mongering, this is homophobia. There's no correlation.
We've already seen it's a real trend with this whole child drag queen thing. That's something that's really that's too much. But also, to be fair, I also find child beauty contests to be also equally creepy. It's the same thing.
Remember the John Benet Ramsey murder case?
Yeah. But now John Benet Ramsey, or the Ramsey, the girl, but now it would just be a boy dressed in drag. But it's the same thing. It's insane, too much. No sexualization of children, whether it's in a heterosexual context or a gay drag context. Just to be clear about this one. That's no exception. That's also
but the thing is that they're kind of trying to smuggle in the threats of over acceptance. It's actually beyond normalization. They're actually enforcing it as a moral virtue, to the extent that if you're sexualizing children that way, it's okay. That's how you know that they've over promoted the I'm against gay bashing or violence against people or exclusion from basic right to work and things like.
Well, obviously, it's like talking to someone who has a small abnormality in their personality and then beating them on them for it every day. You know what I mean? If someone has like a lazy eye, you can't beat them till their eye becomes less lazy. You know what I mean? It's the same thing. And I think people in the past who had a different view of the way human beings work were just thought, well, you choose to be that way completely and you just want to be weird, so we'll put you in jail. It's just dumb by modern context.
Right. That's a good way of putting it. But now, they really push the envelope. But what I see that Yang actually, he was actually talking more like men's rights talking points, and he was talking more about things that, he was talking about, so you're asking like, well, then what's my problem with him? Because I understand the nonprofit industrial, labor apex complex combined with Silicon Valley that he comes from. Now, like what he's actually talking about is taking, is actually normalizing and saying like, look, like all these things in your life, all these jobs in your life are going to be automated and roboticized, but they're going to be done by corporations. And now, if you understand corporation theory or publicly traded companies, there's always been an element of possibility within corporations of public control, shareholder democracy, different types of left-wing corporatism.
There's also a lot of legislation that controls the actions of every company in America.
A lot. There is a lot, but more than controlling actions of corporations, though, is that it's laying a foundation to transition the American economy into a post-labor, gift economy, which theoretically, within the framework of the logic of the expanding means of production and the logic of automation, it would have to go in that direction because only human labor ultimately creates value. In individual exchange, like on the marginal theory of value, I can pick up surpluses on the margins, but fundamentally, if human beings are not involved in making things, if human beings don't have jobs that pay them, salaries, then they don't have money to buy things with. But those things that they're trying to buy, but here's the critical point, Tim. Those things that they're trying to buy, in turn, were not made by people, and so they're either incredibly cheap or have no cost at all. You see,
Yeah.
so it's actually a gift economy. So what Yang is actually being, this is not accelerationism, it's actually belatedness. Because if you look at China, they've already converted whole factories that used to employ 5, 10, and 15,000 people, and they're down to 3, 4, 500 people through introduction of robots. But because it's like a socialist system, let's say, or a state monopoly system, that they can transition that without all these, I guess, political and economic pushbacks from private companies, right? So it just so my real issue is not that UBI is a bad idea, and my real issue is not that roboticization or automation is not inevitable, because it basically is. I mean, fighting against that is like what the Luddites failed to do 170, 190 years ago in England during the Industrial Revolution, right? That doesn't work. It's like you can set up kind of like anarchist brigades to blow up factories, or like in Fight Club, right? At the end of the movie, Fight Club, they like blew up the financial buildings or something like that. I mean, that's the level of things that you would have to do to try to turn the hands back of time, and those don't work either. It would have to be terrorism and violence. So now Yang is talking about terrorism and violence of truck drivers as Google phases out and they introduce, driverless vehicles. He's saying first with the trucking industry through Google. But this is actually a plan of Silicon Valley. But this actually was Google, Facebook, YouTube, and he's a Russiagator. So I know I'm saying a lot of different things, jumping around here.
Yeah,
but he's actually
I'm getting a little lost here, to be honest.
Look, it's very simple. When asked, what's the story with Russia? He goes, they definitely interfered with the election. And I don't need to be absolutely certain of that. I'm just going to go with, 70, 80% probability. And then we're going to hit them hard, whatever, war, cyber war, whatever. I mean, he's a Russiagator. Okay. And the thing is that in the first interview with Rogan, he was like on some hip hop.
Shapiro? No, hip hop. Oh boy.
It was a hip hop radio station out of New York that live streams their shows on YouTube.
Oh yeah, that I forgot.
It was either that one or it was on the Joe Rogan. He was like he came out kind of soft on Russia, but at the end of the interview or the next interview, he was actually a very big Russiagator. So that was like the red light went off for me. And then when I started to put together his references and how the actual structure of this whole thing, what it looks like I mean, you're going to have like Google, AdSense, YouTube. It's one conglomerate, Facebook. They're all kind of bought in Silicon Valley. And that they're the primary backers of Yang to work with and through community grassroots organizations, a nonprofit industrial complex, and what's left of organized labor. They represent something like less than 9% of the workforce now because they have.
We brought it up. We talked about in our first episode about Russia, but just one thing then to sort of harken back to our previous episode. Why is it so universal among the Democratic candidates to be Russiagators and to be terrified of Russia? Why? Why do you think?
Well, because that is the system. There's like a bureaucracy that has inertia. There are whole juntas within the United States military-industrial complex that were structures that were inherited from the Cold War, and they are firm believers. There's basically a difference of opinion in American elites. That split a number of different ways, but the Democrat Party and most Republicans as well, they're all a certain type of neoconservative that is committed to the theory of being basically, a little bit firm on China, but trying to get China to break from Russia. They're continuing the Nixon-Mao concept of geopolitics, which is to promote China over Russia. But the sort of minority, Trump thing was like, no, you have to get everyone against China because China's unstoppable, right? So you got to give Russia Crimea, F this thing in Ukraine, start getting the EU to pay more into NATO, but get NATO to be transformed from a Russia thing into a Pacific force, right?
Yeah,
to
yeah,
transfer,
yeah.
right? So I think it's really about that. But as I wrote in my article from a number of years ago, even before Trump was even a candidate, when Obama was president, I wrote an article called "From Pax Americana to Pan Americana," and I talked about how the United States would have to return to a Monroe Doctrine 2.0 and basically assert
And that's kind of what's happening. And that was very, very brilliant of you to see that coming in the future, because that's the whole thing with Trump and Fortress America. I think in some ways there are certain people who are even sort of thinking, okay, well, we could either back Russia or we could back China. Maybe we should just go back to completely dominating and exploiting South and Central America.
That's the idea.
And that's what Fortress America is kind of doing. And if you look at Trump's actions, I think he's kind of actually following that. Because more or less, where he's the most hot and he actually takes action, it's there, not anywhere else.
That's it. And that's where they actually can have success. Look, it's also an issue, you have to think about geography and supply line security. And look at the distance. I mean, you have the Gulf of Mexico. The thing, and what I proposed, this is like 5 years ago or 4 years ago when I wrote this. What I proposed at the time was that the United States has to completely reconfigure their ideological orientation towards Latin America, and they would have to, as I said, deploy their America's Caribbean and Afro-Caribbean population to interface with Caribbean and Brazilian populations, and for America to weaponize and use their own Latino elite and in the Southwest to interface with Latin America, and that America would have to be in the way that the Roman Empire became increasingly Frankish, or increasingly whatever they were dominating in the East, they became increasingly Anatolian, increasingly Turkish towards the end. The American Empire would have to integrate into Latin America, not to superimpose a foreign Anglo-Saxon sort of framework of, like Weber's, WASP, right? That doesn't interface culturally.
You're
There's going to be
going back. It's a little bit of the whole the land versus sea empire, and
that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about transforming the United States to a land power.
Yeah. Which is very interesting. There's a certain philosopher in Russia who is probably smiling right now if he's hearing these words. I can imagine that. But so that's a very interesting, and in a lot of ways, why I think Fortress America is interesting. I also think it could also, there's also certain, from Trump's perspective, I actually think he just finds South America a bit more exploitable, because I think Nixon had a very racist and naive view that Chinese people, what are they going to do? They're just going to sit around and do whatever we want, and they're not a real competition. And then all of a sudden, because actually they're one of the most the oldest continuously organized societies on the planet, and we expected them just kind of sit around like aboriginals in the desert. So bad call.
Precisely.
Call.
Yeah. I mean, it's actually, for China, it's been great. And kudos to them. I think that when you look at China's had its own empires and internal and fights, but it's been a historical process. I mean, they're stronger for it now. But when you look at what the British did to China, in the 19th century, and the weaponization of drugs. I mean, the whole idea of using drugs like that to conquer a whole people. I mean, it reminds me a lot of the prison industrial complex in the United States, and it just, the opium and the heroin abuse and the devastated China created, a whole layer of poverty and crime that was completely unnecessary.
I don't know the translation because I don't speak Chinese, but don't the Chinese refer to that period as the century of humiliation or something of that? So you would think that more experts in the United States would have understood that context, that the Chinese definitely feel humiliated, as do the Russians. However, the Russians didn't have centuries of humiliation.
A couple decades,
decades of it. So if people think the Russians are just going to sit around, it's going to be exactly the same thing. But
so what do you think? So let me ask you then. So I mean, like in your, because I know you wrote an article not long ago for Strategic Culture Foundation about Yang.
Yes.
What did you get from besides UBI, and I know that your idea, and I agree with you that UBI is his main thing. But what did you get from his foreign policy ideas? Or did he talk about China at all, or Russia? I mean, I know that the Russiagate thing we talked a little bit.
Remember, you have to understand that when we're looking at, like I say, a product, because that's what he really is. What are the main features? Maybe if you look at some of the ingredients of the Coca-Cola bottle, there will be something interesting there. But overall, he wasn't really talking about that. I wanted to focus mainly on his chances of winning, which we've already discussed here are very low because he's not interesting, he's tiny, and he's not very appealing, right? But also about this whole UBI thing. So that's more what I was getting into. In terms of foreign policy, I think he's just going to be another Democrat. Just another Democrat where it's like, well, we want to bring you to the table and talk, which means do what we say. It's going to be a lot of that passive aggressive or illusions to trying to want to communicate with other people or stuff like that. I think that's probably where I'm going to go.
What wars? I was like tripping out actually the other day because I was having a little cognitive dissonance myself. It seems that when Obama and Bush and Clinton and Bush before, in my young adult lifetime and adult lifetime, it seems that all of them initiated pretty large scale wars. And I was trying to figure out what wars did Trump start, and I couldn't land. None. Yeah, that's and we're already 4 years in now almost, right? I mean, 3. That's really remarkable. I know that I remember memes from 2013 and stuff saying, look, the United States has actually been at war or invaded a country, every military action every 2 years since 1796 or something. It's probably exaggerated because it's every time the Marines were deployed, even merchant Marines. So, but I mean, I know in my lifetime it's very strange because the left has definitely the Trump derangement syndrome.
Well, yeah, because here, if we're right now we're at the Center for Syncretic Studies, but if we're talking about the Strategic Culture Foundation, I recently wrote an article for them, which I think the title is something like "Iran is in Trump's hands," something to that effect. Because basically, with this whole oil tanker possible false flag or whatever that is, I even before it was revealed that Trump is actually kind of not going to support it, I already knew that. Trump, what he does is he comes out strong. How dare the North Koreans? We're America. How dare this? And then he doesn't do anything. You see what I mean? He just really understands that rhetoric means nothing. Words mean nothing. I'll come out. I'll condemn something. And in some ways, Trump's greatest contribution to peace in the world is inaction.
Yeah, I mean, definitely.
Doesn't react. The only time he did anything really aggressive, it almost backfired as if on purpose. I don't mean to be too conspiratorial, but remember when he launched 100 and some rockets at Syria, and about 70% of them were destroyed by missiles before they even got to the counter rockets. By the time they even got to Syrian territory, so that was about it. And even that.
Well, they notified the Russians. They notified the Russians on both occasions, and they were done almost on the same day. In April, 1 year apart. It's and he only did those attacks if you he only authorized those attacks. I think they were from the naval fleet off the shore of Israel or Lebanon. That this came after a week of the Kamala Harris and Cory Booker people saying that we're going to impeach Trump for some other
Well,
whatever.
Even CNN, something like when he launched his missiles, they said something like, "Finally, now Trump has really become the president of the United States.
That was really sick.
He can use force." So yeah, I guess he's just he understands that it's a bit of showmanship. So he's like, "Okay, I'm going to shoot some rockets in the desert. I might kill a handful of people, but got to keep the United States afloat. Too bad. Fire."
See, when I was a kid in the 80s and early 90s, the left, the communists and socialists, not the socialists, but the communists, and no one was a socialist then. That's such a watered down term in many ways, isn't it? But but the radical left, the communists, and let's say the socialists always kind of meant Trotskyists though. Socialist Workers Party, Socialist Action, International Socialist Organization, they were all Trotskyists actually. But the communists and the socialists, I remember, were always anti-war. Like whatever the war was, they were against it. And then it seems that since Obama and the rise of symbolic politics, that they focus on the promises and the things that the politician says. Like you said, it passive aggressively. Let's sit and work it out. But meanwhile, it was the Obama administration, Victoria Nuland. They were actually funding Nazis in Ukraine to overthrow the government.
I think we're entering. Well, human beings are inherently irrational, but we're becoming into this period of maybe hyper irrationality.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
where it's literally all that matters is feelings, facts or truth, or it doesn't matter. It's feelings. Nazis are bad. I feel that Obama condemns Nazis, but no matter what happened in Ukraine, doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. They don't even because I feel that I like Obama. It's feelings.
The center left publications. Didn't even focus on Ukraine. They were focusing on the rise of some philosopher in Russia as the example of rising fascism or something, and that it was happening in the Slavic world, but not Ukraine, but it was Russia, and it was Russian patriotism, and then they were really de-emphasizing the role of the Soviet Union in World War II. And they were really trying to hype up the pre-war non-aggression pact, even though every country had non-aggression agreements, and it seemed that talking about Molotov-Ribbentrop, that this whole revision of history, I've seen a whole generation of youth, radicals, and regular people just completely misinformed on the history of current events, like things that happened like 2-3 years ago, and
Joaquin, let's go to the other side. Let's leave the Democrats away. Conservative sides, every friggin' meme page about from conservatives somehow talks about the Soviet Union and has these death tolls which don't even come anywhere close to the actual Russian numbers. And I don't mean there's a discrepancy. I mean there's a discrepancy of sometimes 10, 20-fold. It's nuts. Just nuts. No one cares about it. It happens on the Republican side too. Because when you think about it, where in the early 1930s did they get this very accurate statistical information about what was happening in the Soviet Union and outside the Soviet Union? Because some of the starvation of the so-called Holodomor actually occurred outside of the Soviet Union's borders, while the Soviet Union was actually under sanctions at the time and had to pay for everything in grain. It's this very weird thing. Where do they get these numbers from that are horribly inflated? I can even say I can't remember the name of the canal, but during one of the first not fun projects of a gulagish nature was the Soviets forced about 12,000 people to build more than 12,000 to build a canal somewhere in Russia. It was their first public project using prisoners. And I think 12,000 people died. That's where the number. 12,000 people died, according to the Russian numbers. If you look on Wikipedia, 250,000. Where'd they get that number from? Doesn't say. But these absurd numbers and absurd inflation of a lot of things that happened in Russia, it's unchecked. No one cares. And unfortunately, it then creates this weird backlash where you get people who want to say funny things like Hitler did nothing wrong, ha ha ha. And it's also sort of creating this backlash where now, because their view is so absurd, the people who are against it are starting to be as absurd as nothing ever happened in Russia bad. Nothing. It's all a lie. Done. And that's also not very good policy to have.
So when I think about how I'm Mexican American and I never had a dog in the Russia or Orthodoxy story race until recently. I moved to Serbia 7 years ago, but I've been opposing U.S. invasions and war crimes since I was a kid, and that was just the environment I was raised in. I'm thankful that my parents had those views. And I've challenged them in my mind and thought it through. And I think for myself, I'm 41 years old, and they're solid views. I mean, it's war is hell, and initiating an aggressive war is morally and ethically wrong, and it's people of conscience universally oppose that. All over the world, you can ask people.
Yeah.
and it just seems like such a basic thing to me, but it's in the United States, it's become like permissible to be basically chauvinistic or even xenophobic, and I would say somehow racist against Russians. And that everything, if you were to like take all the Russophobic memes and concepts and conspiracy theories, and you were to replace the word Russian with Jewish, you would have anti-Semitic. It would be completely, neo-Nazi anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
So,
people don't see that because again, people are irrational. But anyways, Joaquin, we're at the hour mark, so I just want to say about Yang. We kind of got off topic, but that's fine. It's good to go off topic sometimes. About Yang, to repeat myself, this UBI is cool. It's a lot more valuable than Yang is himself. At some point, he's going to fall, and maybe, I can't guarantee it, I'm not going to put down $100 on it, but I have a strong feeling he's going to pass that idea off to someone else who's a lot more marketable, but that person will win the election and not get UBI implemented. That's my prediction on where this whole thing is going.
I mean, like, see, Sanders has talked about, I'm with you on that, by the way, to clarify. I'm with you on that. But see, Sanders talked about basically it's doing an expansion of the of what Obama did with the United Auto Workers, which was to allow the union bosses to use the union dues or to leverage a loan versus the future union dues to purchase and increase their stock option or ownership of the company. And that's what Sanders has, said that he was interested in looking at. But that doesn't approach the real macroeconomic long-term issues of automation the way that Yang has.
And that seems like a gateway to corruption.
Well, it certainly is. I mean, it's basically it's a feedback loop back into the power elite. But this idea that organized labor on the level of the leadership represents its membership, I can attest that it's false, but there's many better qualified labor historians and social theorists that have, spoken to that point. But being on the ground, on the shop floor, and having been a business agent and negotiator and involved in campaigns and also internal union elections, like those things are thrown, right? So that's, if you have a criminal syndicalism or like a shakedown operation, the difference between criminal syndicalism and a labor union, like the difference between me threatening you that a mob is going to show up and do something and a labor union is that the workers are supposed to vote for the leadership. Yeah. But if you deploy the professional staff of the leadership of the union rather to keep the leadership in power, to like go to influence the opinions of the shop stewards or to only focus your campaigns on certain work sites that support the leadership and not, take the ballots to the shop floors or the parts of the local that don't support the leadership. I mean, that's corruption in the unions that is against, the...
Well, yeah, and union electoral policies are not exactly made public either. So, yeah, absolutely. But so anyways, we're at the hour mark. So this was Front and Center. I'm Tim Kirby. With me, I should say, not joining me. I'm not the host here. It's a two-man gig. With me was Joaquin Flores. And Joaquin, pretty soon we're going to try to get some other members of the Center for Syncretic Studies to join up with us. So hopefully there'll be 3 or 4 of us here in the very near future. So anyways, I guess all I have to say is good night from Moscow.
Yeah, good night from Belgrade.
All right. Talk to you soon in the next episode of Front and Center.